In the quiet, conservative village of Kano, Nigeria, a hidden affair between a 49-year-old Muslim wife and her husband's 19-year-old nephew begins a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. As the forbidden love festers in the shadows, it leads to a brutal murder that stuns the village and culminates in a horrific form of justice where the villagers take matters into their own hands. This is a story of betrayal, revenge, and tradition clashing with modern desires. Mariam was well known in the village of Kano, respected not only for her beauty, but also for the grace with which she carried herself. At 49, she was a woman who had seen much in life. She had been married to Ibrahim since she was in her early 20s, a marriage arranged by their families. Ibrahim, a successful businessman, had built a fortune through years of hard work, providing Mariam with everything she needed: comfort, wealth, and status. But as the years passed, their relationship had begun to feel like an arrangement rather than a marriage. The bond they once shared had quietly eroded, leaving behind a hollow structure of duty and routine. Despite the grand house they lived in, which stood as a symbol of Ibrahim's success, the loneliness inside those walls was profound for Mariam. She had children, now grown and married, who visited only occasionally, leaving her with an empty home for long stretches. Ibrahim's business trips had become more frequent as the years went by. He was often away, handling matters far from Kano, and when he was home, his focus was on his work. He barely noticed how Mariam spent her days, and she, in turn, grew accustomed to his absence. There was no longer warmth between them. Conversations were brief, centered around business or household affairs, and their moments together had lost the intimacy they once shared. There was a deep silence between them, one that neither of them dared to acknowledge. It was around this time that Khaled entered their lives. The nephew of Ibrahim, Khaled, was 19, fresh-faced, full of life, and eager to prove himself. He had come to stay with them for a few months, as he prepared for his university entrance exams. The family had offered him their home for this period to help him focus on his studies, and Mariam had welcomed him kindly, seeing him as another son. Khaled was everything Ibrahim was not: young, energetic, and curious about the world. While Ibrahim was often away on business, Khaled was around, helping Mariam with small tasks around the house. He had a way of lightening the mood with his youthful spirit, and Mariam found herself drawn to the vibrancy he brought into her dull routine. They would speak about his studies, his dreams of becoming a doctor, and the hopes he had for his future. Mariam admired his drive and determination, qualities she had once seen in her husband when they were young but had long since faded. As the weeks passed, Khaled's presence in the house became more significant. He began to spend more time with Mariam, helping with household chores when he wasn't studying. He would assist her in the garden, sometimes sitting with her under the shade of the large tree in the courtyard. There, they would talk, their conversations slowly shifting from everyday matters to more personal subjects. Khaled would share stories about his childhood, his experiences growing up, and the challenges he faced. Mariam listened, feeling a connection growing between them. It was subtle, at first, something she didn't fully understand. There were moments when their hands would brush against each other, accidentally. Moments when their eyes met and lingered a little too long. These small, almost innocent gestures began to stir something within Mariam that she had not felt in years. she began to notice how handsome Khaled was, how different he was from Ibrahim. While her husband had grown older, with the weight of years on his shoulders, Khaled was full of youth and promise. He had a vitality that was missing from her life, and slowly, the lines between their innocent relationship and something more began to blur. Miriam found herself thinking about Khaled more often, wondering when he would return from his studies, anticipating the next moment they would spend together. She felt guilty for these thoughts, knowing they were wrong, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. For the first time in years, she felt alive. By March of 2004, the tension between them had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. The attraction that had been building quietly beneath the surface began to manifest in subtle yet undeniable ways. Miriam and Khaled would exchange glances that lingered longer than they should. Their conversations, once light and casual, took on a deeper, more intimate tone. They began to seek out moments to be alone together, even if it was just for a few minutes. Khaled, too, felt the pull of their connection, though he knew the risks involved. He knew what it would mean for them both if anyone found out, but the excitement was too much to resist. It started with small, seemingly harmless encounters. They would meet late at night after Ibrahim had left for another one of his trips. At first, it was nothing more than conversation, long, winding talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning. But as time went on, the nature of their meetings shifted. What began as innocent companionship transformed into something forbidden. They began to meet in secret, first in the quiet corners of the house, then in more secluded areas where they knew they wouldn't be seen. The affair became a dangerous dance of stolen moments. The thrill of secrecy, of sneaking around, added to the allure. Miriam's long-repressed desires began to surface, and with each meeting, the boundaries they had once respected dissolved. They both knew what they were doing was forbidden in their village, where honor and tradition were everything, but they were caught in the intoxicating web of their affair, too far gone to stop. Miriam's guilt grew as the affair deepened. She knew what it would mean for her and for Khaled if they were caught. In Kano, where Islamic law was strictly adhered to, an affair like theirs would not only bring shame upon her family, but could lead to severe consequences. Yet, despite the risks, she couldn't pull herself away from Khaled. He had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years, something that made her feel alive again in ways she had long forgotten. As March came to an end, the weight of their secret began to press down on them. They had gone too far to turn back now, and the consequences of their actions loomed large over them. Yet, they continued their affair, meeting in the shadows, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The quiet village of Kano, where everyone knew everyone, was blissfully unaware of the dangerous secret unfolding behind the walls of Miriam's home. But it was only a matter of time before their affair would be discovered, and when that happened, the consequences would be more devastating than either of them could have imagined. By May of 2004, Ibrahim's travels had taken him across many cities in Nigeria, securing deals that brought in wealth and further cemented his position as one of the most successful businessmen in Kano. He had always taken pride in being a provider for his family. His absence from home was something he justified as a necessary sacrifice. After all, He had given Mariam everything: security, wealth, and respect in the community. Yet something had begun to feel wrong when he last returned home. On the evening of May 2nd, 2004, Ibrahim arrived home earlier than expected from a trip to Lagos. He had not informed Mariam of his early return, hoping to surprise her. But when he walked into their grand home, something felt off. The house was unusually quiet. He noticed that Khaled, who was usually quick to greet him with a smile, seemed nervous. There was a shift in the atmosphere, something subtle but palpable. Mariam, too, had changed. She was wearing brighter clothes, and her hair seemed more carefully styled than usual. She had always taken care of her appearance, but there was a noticeable effort now, as if she were trying to impress someone. Ibrahim didn't say anything at first. He watched, quietly observing. It wasn't just Khaled's nervousness or Mariam's sudden interest in looking more attractive that disturbed him. It was the way they seemed to avoid each other, and yet couldn't help stealing glances when they thought no one was looking. There was something happening between them, something that Ibrahim couldn't quite grasp, but felt deep in his bones. Over the next few days, his suspicion grew. Ibrahim, once too preoccupied with business to notice the details of home life, now became hyper-aware of everything around him. He noticed the way Khaled would leave the room when Mariam entered, the way Mariam avoided meeting his eyes when he asked her simple questions. And then there were the small, seemingly insignificant things. Khaled lingering too long by the doorway of the kitchen when Mariam was cooking. The sound of hushed conversations late at night when Ibrahim pretended to sleep. On May 10th, 2004, Ibrahim's worst fears were confirmed. That evening, while Mariam was out visiting the market, Ibrahim went into their bedroom. As he moved about the room, straightening things up, his eye caught something unusual: a piece of folded paper tucked inside one of Mariam's scarves. Curiosity gripped him as he unfolded the note, and the words scribbled inside made his heart pound in his chest. It was a love letter, written in a handwriting that wasn't Mariam's. The words were intimate, describing secret moments, stolen kisses, and plans to meet again. It was addressed to her, from Khaled, his own blood. Ibrahim felt the room spinning. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and the world he had known collapsed in an instant. His wife, the woman he had trusted and provided for, had betrayed him. And Khaled, the nephew he had taken under his wing, had repaid his kindness with deceit. Ibrahim stood there for a long time, his hands trembling as he reread the note. There was a coldness in his heart now, a clarity that cut through the shock. He knew what had to be done, but he wouldn't act immediately. No, revenge was best served cold. He would wait, and when the time was right, he would ensure that both Mariam and Khaled paid for what they had done. Over the next few weeks, Ibrahim pretended as if nothing was wrong. He went about his daily routine, as usual, maintaining his composure. He did not confront Mariam, nor did he let Khaled suspect that he knew of their betrayal. But every night, as he lay beside Mariam, his mind was filled with images of their affair. He imagined the secret meetings, the stolen glances, the lies they must have told to keep him in the dark. It was this constant torment that ate away at him, fueling his need for retribution. By mid-June, Ibrahim's patience had worn thin. On the night of June 15th, 2004, He returned home from a business meeting. The house was quiet, with only the soft hum of the ceiling fan breaking the silence. He had waited long enough. That night, as he sat alone in the living room, something in him snapped. The betrayal, the lies, the dishonor. It was all too much. He could no longer keep the rage contained. At around 10 p.m., Ibrahim walked into the room where Khaled was studying. There was a tension in the air as Ibrahim stood there, watching his nephew, who had no idea what was about to happen. Mariam, who had been in the kitchen preparing tea, sensed that something was wrong and entered the room. The moment she saw Ibrahim's face, she knew. He had found out. Without raising his voice, Ibrahim began to speak. He addressed them both calmly, recounting the events of the past few months, the secret notes, the stolen moments. Mariam's face drained of color as she realized that their affair had been discovered. Khaled, too, was pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words. They tried to explain themselves, but Ibrahim didn't want to hear it. The words only seemed to fuel his anger further. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but for those present, it felt like an eternity. Ibrahim, his rage finally boiling over, grabbed a knife from the nearby kitchen counter. Mariam screamed, pleading for him to stop, but her words fell on deaf ears. The air was thick with tension, and in the blink of an eye, Ibrahim lunged at Khaled, the knife glinting under the dim light. Khaled tried to defend himself, his hands raised in desperation, but he was no match for the fury of his uncle. The first blow landed on Khaled's chest, and then another and another. Blood spattered across the room as Ibrahim's anger manifested in brutal, frenzied strikes. Khaled's body fell to the floor, lifeless, as the knife fell from Ibrahim's trembling hand. Mariam stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely breathe as she stared at the lifeless body of her lover, Khaled, lying in a pool of blood. Her mind struggled to process the horror of what had just happened. Her entire world had shattered in an instant. She screamed, begging Ibrahim for mercy, but it was too late. Khaled was gone, and the blood was on Ibrahim's hands. Ibrahim, now standing over Khaled's body, felt the weight of what he had done. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the realization of the irreversible act he had just committed. He had killed his own nephew in a moment of uncontrollable rage, and now there was no turning back. The room, once filled with the sounds of life, was now eerily quiet. The only sound that remained was the steady drip of blood hitting the floor, marking the end of the life that had once filled their home. And with that, the fate of all three was sealed. The events of that night would change their lives forever, and the village of Kano would never forget the day when betrayal, love, and rage collided in the most devastating way. In the early hours of June 16th, 2004, the village of Kano was abruptly awakened by the piercing sound of screams coming from Mariam and Ibrahim's household. It was the type of sound that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it, a sound filled with horror and disbelief. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, confusion spreading through the narrow streets as people gathered outside the large house. Word quickly spread that something terrible had happened. By the time the police arrived, the scene inside the house was a blood-soaked nightmare. Khaled's body lay motionless on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding him. The once lively young man, full of promise, was now reduced to a lifeless figure. His face, once so full of hope and youth, was now cold and pale. The brutality of the attack was unmistakable, and the sight of it would haunt those who entered the house for years to come. The police, trying to maintain order in the chaotic scene, began their investigation immediately. Ibrahim, still shaken by the events of the previous night, attempted to downplay the situation. He spoke calmly, explaining to the officers that it had been a necessary act to restore his family's honor. He admitted to killing Khaled, claiming that the betrayal of both his wife and his nephew had left him with no choice. He spoke about the shame that the affair had brought upon his household, framing his actions as a necessary evil in a village where honor meant everything. But the police were not easily convinced. While they understood the cultural implications of dishonor, they also knew that a life had been taken and justice had to be served. The investigation continued, and as the police combed through the details, the full story of the affair between Mariam and Khaled began to unfold. By the morning of June 17, 2004, the village was buzzing with gossip. News of the affair and Khaled's tragic death spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in every home, shop, and marketplace. The story was on everyone's lips, and soon the shame was not only on Mariam and Ibrahim, but also on Khaled's parents, who had entrusted their son to his uncle's care. The affair had not only shattered one household, but had rippled through the entire village, casting a dark cloud over families once considered honorable. Khaled's parents were devastated. They had lost a son in the most dishonorable way imaginable, and the betrayal by their own kin made the grief unbearable. His mother, in particular, was inconsolable. The image of her son, now gone forever, was something she could not erase from her mind. His father, though heartbroken, carried the weight of their family's honor. He understood the shame Khaled had brought upon them and struggled with the emotions of both losing his son and knowing that Khaled had been involved in something so forbidden. The village, too, felt the weight of this scandal. In Kano, where family honor and Islamic traditions governed every aspect of life, such an affair was an unforgivable sin. People whispered in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had happened. How could Mariam, a woman of such high standing, risk everything for an affair with a boy? How could Khaled, a promising young man, betray his uncle in such a manner? The questions lingered, but the answers seemed elusive. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the police were facing a difficult situation. While Ibrahim had admitted to the killing, the elders of the village stepped forward, insisting that this was a matter of honor, not something to be handled in a courtroom. The cultural values of the community came into sharp focus, and the village council, a group of respected elders, was called to decide the fate of those involved. In early July 2004, the council met in secret, their discussions shaped by years of tradition and the weight of maintaining the community's honor. There were some who argued that the case should be taken to court, that the law should decide what happened next. But many others believed that publicizing the affair any further would only bring more disgrace to the village. A quiet resolution, they argued, was necessary. On July 21st, 2004, under the cover of night, the council reached its decision. Mariam, as the one who had initiated the affair and brought dishonor upon the family, would face the harshest punishment. In their eyes, her actions had not only betrayed her husband, but had also led to the loss of a life. And for that, she would be executed. That same night, villagers gathered in a secluded area outside of town. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on everyone present. Mariam, once respected, now stood before them as a condemned woman. She had brought shame not only to her household, but to the entire community. And in the eyes of the villagers, there was only one way to cleanse that shame. The execution was swift, carried out in silence under the gaze of the villagers. There was no trial, no chance for her to explain herself. The villagers acted as both jury and executioners, hanging her as a grim reminder of what happened when one strayed from the path of righteousness. Mariam's lifeless body swung gently in the night air, her fate sealed by the community she once called her own. It was a brutal form of justice, born out of tradition and honor, with no room for mercy. As for Ibrahim, his role in Khalid's death could not go unpunished. Though he had killed to defend his honor, the council knew that he had taken justice into his own hands. The law could not be ignored entirely. He was arrested by the police shortly after Mariam's execution. The villagers did not fight this decision, understanding that while his actions were rooted in honor, he had still taken a life in a fit of rage. Ibrahim was taken to a local prison, where he would await trial for murder. Though many in the village sympathized with him, knowing that his actions had been driven by the shame of betrayal, they also understood that the law had to intervene. Justice in this case would be served on two fronts. Mariam had paid for the affair with her life, and Ibrahim would pay for taking the law into his own hands. By the morning of July 22nd, 2004, the village had returned to an eerie calm. The bodies of Mariam and Khaled had been buried, but the weight of their actions hung over the community like a dark cloud. The whispers persisted, questions left unanswered. How had things spiraled so far out of control? What had driven Mariam and Khaled to risk everything for their forbidden affair? The villagers went back to their routines, but the memory of what had happened lingered. People spoke in hushed tones about the affair, the murder, and the execution. Though the events had come to a conclusion, the scars they left behind would take years to heal. The village had exacted its own form of justice, but at what cost? Khalid's parents, though heartbroken, felt that the punishment was necessary to restore their family's dignity. Yet, in their quiet moments, they wondered if there had been another way, if their son's life could have been saved had things not escalated so quickly. They mourned not just for the loss of their son, but for the future that had been taken from him. The village of Kano, though shaken by the events, would continue as it always had. But the story of Mariam, Khaled, and Ibrahim would become a cautionary tale, passed down through generations, a reminder of the dangers of dishonor and the swift, unforgiving justice that followed when one strayed too far from the path. We have another case where the affair wasn't with the nephew. It's the case where a Muslim wife's secret affair with husband's cousin ends in murder. Please like and subscribe for more interesting cases.